Welcome back, Geometry. In this video, we'll be talking about congruent triangles and CPCTC and what exactly all of that means. So go ahead and take out something to write with because we are going to take some notes. So if you'd like to take a moment and pause the video, this way you can go ahead and draw the graphic organizer that is shown on the screen. Okay, welcome back. So let's start off by defining congruent triangles. So when a triangle, and I'm going to just draw a picture of a triangle. When a triangle is transformed by translation, rotation, or reflection, the result is two triangles that are congruent. Now, congruent, remember, means having equal measure and that they're the same. And I'm going to put the symbol for congruent in parentheses. So it's like that equal sign. Oh, the result. It's like the equal sign and like a tilde over it. Okay, so let's say we have the statement triangle PIG is congruent to triangle P prime, I prime, G prime. So let's go ahead and just quickly draw a picture of both of these triangles. So let's see, here is P, I, oh, whoops, actually I wanted to draw that down here. So let's say triangle P, I, G, and then triangle P prime, I prime, G prime. So these two triangles are right next to each other. All right, let's say we've got this statement up here that triangle PIG is congruent to P prime, I prime, G prime. Well, we can mark up our diagram, and this is how we would mark it up. Let's look at the first two letters. So PI, we would look at the statement, and that's how we would start marking up our diagram. So for example, PI, those first two letters, that segment is congruent to P prime, I prime. So I'm going to mark that like this. Okay. And then we can look at the last two letters. So IG is congruent to I prime, G prime. So I'm going to mark it with different tick marks just to show that those two segments are congruent. And then we would take a look at the first and the last letter. So P and G is telling us that it's congruent to P prime and G prime. So then I'm just going to go ahead and mark that with like a little squiggle on my picture. So when we're given that statement that two triangles are congruent, we can go ahead and mark a diagram just like what we're shown. And we would use this statement right here to figure out which angles and which sides are congruent. Okay, so the angles would be labeled similarly. So what that means is I would take a look at that first letter. So angle P is congruent to P prime. So I'm going to mark that with an arc. So P is congruent to P prime. And then we can look at the second letter and see that I is congruent to I prime. So I'm going to mark that with two arcs on my picture. So I is congruent to I prime. And then that last one, since it's the last letter, we're going to say G is congruent to G prime. And I'm going to go ahead and mark that with one arc and a tick going through it. Okay, so that's how we can mark our picture, and I would suggest using different colors if you have it, or maybe a pencil and a pen if you have that. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, if we've got two congruent triangles, then we can say something called CPCTC. And what that means is corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So that's what I mean by corresponding parts. So since P is the first letter in that first triangle and P prime is the first letter in that second triangle, then those are corresponding angles. Since I is the second letter in the triangle PIG and I prime is the second angle in the triangle P prime, I prime, G prime, then angle I and angle I prime are corresponding angles. And we can say the same thing for the sides. And so what can we say? Well, now we're going to take everything that we marked up on our diagram and just write congruency statements. So we can say angle P is congruent to angle P prime. We can say angle I is congruent to angle I prime, and we can say angle G is congruent to angle G prime. And then we can write similar statements for the segments. So we can say, we can say segment PI is congruent to segment P prime I prime. We can say segment IG is congruent to segment I prime G prime. And we can say segment PG is congruent to segment P prime G prime. So we can get those 6 congruency statements. Thanks for watching. If you need to, go back and rewatch any parts that you may need to finish your notes. And in the next couple videos, we'll be going over some examples.